one thing I wanted to make sure we get in as the time allows, because we are running a little short on it now, is I do want to unpack the difference, Wes, between the Gospel of Thomas and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And why that matters too, from my background, especially as a Muslim, is a lot of the Infancy Gospel quasi sort of nuggets of narrative make their way into the Quran, or at least to common Muslim understanding of the life of Jesus. And so it's important because more than 1.5 billion people actually would buy into the belief that this has some historical warrant to it. But there's a difference between the Gospel of Thomas and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So help us with that, Wes.
Yeah, so there are a few passages in the Quran that we can trace in terms of their storyline and content to other sources. And one of those is the Arab Infancy Gospel. Now, the Arab Infancy Gospel and Infancy Gospel literature in general kind of props up at a later time because people are just curious as to what Jesus was like. I mean, we have a story in the Gospel of Luke of Jesus being 12 and going back to the temple in Jerusalem with his family. But other than that, we really don't have anything at all about Jesus's childhood. And this is actually not unusual in kind of this ancient biographical literature. You focus on what is pertinent to what you're trying to communicate. And if there's something that's relevant to their childhood, then you mention that. So it's not unusual to see this for the time frame that we're talking about. It is unusual in modern day biographical literature, but not in ancient biographical literature. And so later on, people started to think, okay, what was Jesus like as a child? And so you have a number of infancy gospel narratives that pop up, one of which is the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which comes around the 5th or 6th century. And so it's not the Gospel of Thomas.
Way late.
Yeah, very late. And this is part of the problem in kind of all of this literature. And this is a sidebar, but one of the issues that really had the early Christians nailing down the canon of Scripture in terms of the 27 books of the New Testament and disputing some books that are actually now in our Bible, things like 2nd and 3rd John or 1st and 2nd Peter, is because there were other books floating around with these individuals' names on them, right? There were a lot of books with John and Peter on them. And so the early church kind of slowed down and said, we need to do our due diligence to make sure that we're actually reading and copying and spreading the books that come from the actual Peter and John. And part of this is that there are a few documents, none of them legitimate, that have Thomas's name on it. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And so these often get confused. And part of the problem with this is that if a Muslim wants to use the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas as a piece of literature that is valid, that communicates who Jesus truly was, because it includes the story of Jesus making clay birds and breathing on them, and that being included in the Quranic narrative, but they're confusing it with the Gospel of Thomas, then they're getting themselves into all sorts of trouble because of this Gnostic undertone, right? The Gnostics believed that the creator of the universe was evil, and that's part and parcel why the physical is bad. Well, Christians, Muslims alike would deny that outright, right? We don't believe that the creator of the universe is an evil demiurge. And so I've always thought it was unusual when Muslims want to try to claim certain Gnostic texts because maybe they deny the crucifixion, or maybe they have something that sounds like what you'd read in the Quran. But that gets really problematic very fast, because if you want this piece that sounds right to what you're saying, but you don't include all the rest, well, by what methodology are you using to try to discern that is original, that is authentic, and that is not? But you're exactly right. You have some of this. The Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas is not the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is far, far earlier, although not as early as the 1st century when Jesus actually lived. But the Arab Infancy Gospel of Thomas, also the proto-gospel, the proto-evangelion of James, also has some content that ends up in the Quran. So you do have some of this later apocryphal, that being, stuff that didn't end up in the canon. Apocrypha means strange in Greek. And so it's sort of got associated with things that were not canonical, which is the rule and standard of the books that God inspired. And so some of these later books are floating around places like Arabia in the 7th century, and they end up getting included in the narratives that eventually make their way into the Quran.
And so this is a couple of important points here, because that I was, by the way, a propagator of these arguments before I became a Christian, only to realize the inconsistency that I would have. I mean, as a Muslim, I would say, well, you can't trust the Gospels. They were changed and corrupted over time, and any accounts that were relatively early came decades after Jesus's life, and therefore you really can't trust that. Of course, the glaring contradiction was, well, I think the Quran references Jesus's life, and that's centuries after his life. But also the fact that if you're going to rely on these things, whether it's Gospel of Thomas or Arab Infancy Gospel or the Proto-Evangelion, these are far later than the gospel documents. And so we're relying on those as if they were authentic, but these are hundreds of years later, which of course is the argument I'm making in the first place. You can't rely on the gospel because they're decades later. Well, if I had to pick between two things, decades later or hundreds of years later, I'm picking decades. And of course, I think that there's a good argument to make that they're not nearly as late, the gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts. I don't think that these historical narratives are hundreds or even many, many decades later. But even if they were, they're definitely better candidates for the historical Jesus than anything else we're mentioning.